It was a suffocating Friday afternoon in July of 1967, the kind of New York City heat that clings to your skin and seeps into the very brick of Harlem. Outside, the vibrant pulse of 125th Street hammered against the humid air, but inside Arthur "Artie" Finch's cramped, nondescript office, the only sound was the frantic scratch of a pen and the rhythmic click of an adding machine. Artie, Bumpy Johnson's personal accountant, wasn't sweating from the oppressive summer air. No, his brow was slick with a cold dread, a fear that had been a silent companion for 7 long years. Every Friday, precisely at 4 Northern p.m., Artie would finalize the books for Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Laundromats, real estate holdings, legitimate fronts that churned out cash like clockwork. And every Friday, with the meticulous precision of a ghost in the machine, Artie Finch would move a portion of that cash, not into Bumpy's secure accounts, but into a web of his own offshore havens, a quiet heist that now totaled over $3 million. $3 million, siphoned from the undisputed godfather of Harlem, a man whose legend was carved in steel and whispered in every back alley from Sugar Hill to the Hudson. Some debts are paid in blood, others in secrets. How does a man like Artie Finch, a soft-spoken numbers guy with a gambling problem and a nervous twitch, manage to steal that much from Bumpy Johnson? For 7 years, no less. That was the impossible outcome nobody could comprehend. Bumpy wasn't just a gangster. He was a strategic mastermind, a chess player whose moves were calculated 3 steps ahead of anyone else. He commanded respect, not just fear, ruling Harlem with an intellect as sharp as any blade. He was the king, and Artie Finch was the invisible hand picking his pocket, or so Artie thought. He believed himself untouchable, a master of the quiet heist, convinced his meticulous ledgers and offshore shell companies were an impenetrable fortress of lies. But what Artie Finch didn't know, what no one in Harlem truly grasped at the time, was that his carefully constructed house of cards was about to be exposed, not by Bumpy's enforcers, but by the relentless, often overlooked, financial crimes unit of the NYPD. To understand what happened that sweltering July evening, you first need to grasp the true weight of Bumpy Johnson's empire and the delicate balance of power he maintained in a city constantly on the brink of explosion. Harlem in the late 1960s wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a kingdom, a vibrant, tumultuous and fiercely independent territory carved out of the sprawling metropolis of New York City. And Bumpy Johnson was its monarch. He wasn't the kind of mob boss who reveled in public displays of brutality. His power lay in his mind, his network, his ability to negotiate and manipulate the city's complex criminal landscape. From gambling rackets to drug distribution, Bumpy had his fingers in everything, but he also provided for his community, earning a grudging respect even from those who feared him. His word was law, his reputation absolute. To betray Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a financial misstep. It was an act of war against a sovereign power, a direct challenge to the very fabric of Harlem's underworld. The money Artie was stealing wasn't just profit. It was the lifeblood of Bumpy's operations, the fuel for his influence, the capital that kept his legitimate fronts humming and his illicit enterprises thriving. $3 million wasn't just a sum. It was a gaping wound, a silent hemorrhage that threatened to cripple the Godfather's financial strength. Yet, Artie had managed to keep it hidden, a testament to his quiet audacity and Bumpy's unwavering trust in his numbers man. It seemed impossible. How could such a significant drain go unnoticed by a man as shrewd as Bumpy Johnson? The truth was, Artie Finch wasn't just a greedy accountant with a gambling problem. He was a pawn, a piece in a much larger, far more dangerous game being played across the city. His escalating debts weren't just to some anonymous bookie. They were owed to the Genovese family, one of the 5 families, and specifically to an ambitious capo named Vito the Viper Moretti. Moretti saw Harlem as ripe for the taking, a rich territory controlled by an aging king. He wasn't interested in open warfare, not yet. He wanted to destabilize Bumpy from within, to chip away at his foundation until the whole empire crumbled. Artie Finch, with his access to Bumpy's books and his crippling gambling addiction, was the perfect, unsuspecting weapon. Artie, meanwhile, was oblivious to the true scale of the machinations around him. He saw himself as a clever thief, outsmarting his formidable boss, a silent genius of embezzlement. But the shadows he operated in were far deeper than he imagined, and the strings pulling him were attached to hands far more ruthless than Bumpy's. He thought he was playing a solo game of high stakes, but he was merely a blind piece on a chessboard, about to be moved into a devastating checkmate. And the first crack in his carefully constructed facade was about to appear, not from the streets of Harlem, but from a quiet desk in a downtown precinct. The sprawling metropolis of Harlem in the late 1960s was more than just a neighborhood. It was a kingdom, a complex ecosystem thriving on its own rules, its own silent agreements. From the bustling storefronts of 125th Street to the quiet brownstones tucked away on Lenox Avenue, every street corner, every back alley, every legitimate business, from laundromats to real estate holdings, was a piece on a grand chessboard. The numbers game, the policy rackets, the burgeoning drug trade, they all operated beneath a delicate balance of alliances, rivalries, and unspoken codes. To the untrained eye, it was chaos, but to those who understood, it was a finely tuned machine. At the very heart of this intricate system sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't just a man, he was an institution. His power wasn't derived from brute force alone, though he commanded plenty of that. It stemmed from a formidable intellect, a strategic mind that saw 10 moves ahead, and an unnerving calm that made his threats far more terrifying than any raised voice. Bumpy was the undisputed godfather of Harlem, a figure who navigated the treacherous waters between the Italian crime families downtown and the independent operators uptown with a shrewdness that bordered on legend. What was at stake for him wasn't just the millions flowing through his empire. It was territory, it was respect, it was the very fabric of Harlem's underworld that he had meticulously woven together. To defy him, to steal from him, was an act of profound disrespect that threatened to unravel everything. But the NYPD, far removed from the street whispers and the intricate power plays of Harlem, had its own quiet chess players. Downtown, in a nondescript office within the Financial Crimes Unit, worked Detective Miller. Miller wasn't the kind of cop who kicked down doors or engaged in high-speed chases. He was a numbers man, a relentless tracker of ledgers and illicit transactions, often overlooked because his victories rarely made headlines. His world was one of suspicious wire transfers, phantom corporations, and the slow, methodical unraveling of financial deceit. Miller wasn't looking for Bumpy Johnson, not directly. He was simply following the money, chasing down a series of unusual transfers linked to a small-time bookie known for his deep, uncomfortable ties to the Genovese crime family. It started with a hunch, a pattern in the digital dust of bank records. The bookie's accounts showed irregular deposits, far too large for his usual street operations, and they seemed to disappear into a labyrinth of shell corporations. Miller, with his methodical approach, began to connect the dots. One name in particular kept resurfacing, like a stubborn stain on a pristine balance sheet. Arthur Finch. Artie Finch. At first, it was just a name attached to a few legitimate businesses that Bumpy Johnson used as fronts, laundromats, small real estate ventures. Nothing overtly criminal, just a quiet accountant handling the books for a man who cast a long shadow. The initial thought within the precinct was simple, almost mundane. A greedy accountant, perhaps with a gambling problem, skimming off the top, lining his own pockets from the periphery of a powerful criminal enterprise. It happened all the time. But Miller's instincts, honed by years of sifting through financial deception, screamed otherwise. 7 years. The duration of the embezzlement, the sheer audacity of it, the escalating amounts involved. This wasn't just a petty thief. This was a sustained, sophisticated operation. Who would dare to pick the pocket of a man like Bumpy Johnson for so long and with such increasing confidence? And more importantly, who would allow it? The idea that Artie Finch was simply a lone wolf, driven by his own vices, began to feel flimsy, almost too convenient. Miller kept digging, tracing the money's flow, not just from Bumpy's businesses to Artie's accounts, but beyond. He saw the connections to the Genovese-tied bookie, then to other larger transfers that hinted at a much bigger game. The tension in Miller's gut tightened. He knew Artie Finch was doomed, caught between the law and the underworld. But the path to Artie's downfall wasn't the internal reckoning everyone expected from Bumpy Johnson. It was an external, slow-burn police investigation, quietly building momentum, about to expose a truth far more complex than simple fraud. What Detective Miller was about to uncover would shift the entire investigation, revealing that Artie Finch was not just a thief, but a pawn in a much deadlier game. Detective Miller, a man whose career had been built on sifting through the detritus of other people's greed, knew that numbers rarely lied. They might obscure, they might deflect, but beneath the layers of legitimate transactions and coded ledgers, a pattern always emerged. For weeks, his office in the NYPD Financial Crimes Unit, a cramped space smelling of stale coffee and desperation, became a war room. Every cancelled check, every deposit slip, every wire transfer linked to Artie Finch was meticulously scrutinized. The initial anomalies had been subtle, almost dismissive, small, recurring withdrawals from Artie's personal accounts, far too regular for a man of his modest salary, yet not large enough to immediately flag as major embezzlement. But then Miller started cross-referencing. He noticed these withdrawals often coincided with deposits into seemingly unrelated accounts he traced back to shell corporations registered in Delaware, then funneled through a series of regional banks in New Jersey. Banks like the fictionalized Hudson River Trust or Monarch Savings, places far enough from Harlem to avoid immediate scrutiny, yet close enough for regular access. The real breakthrough came when Miller noticed Artie's gambling habits weren't just a personal failing. They were a systemic bleed. He wasn't losing money to anonymous bookies on street corners. The debts, the truly crippling ones, were always settled through a specific network of ostensibly legitimate businesses, a string of laundromats in Little Italy, a wholesale produce distributor in the Bronx, even a small, struggling construction company with contracts across the 5 boroughs. These weren't Bumpy Johnson's enterprises. These were known fronts, whispers confirmed by informants and stale reports, for the Genovese family, and specifically for Vito the Viper Moretti. Miller felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. This wasn't just a crooked accountant stealing from a crime boss. This was a sophisticated, long-term operation. Artie Finch wasn't a lone wolf. He was a carefully placed piece in a much larger game. The detail that had escaped everyone, the true recipient of Artie's gambling debts, was not some faceless bookie, but the architect of a silent invasion. Artie's personal vice had been weaponized. The detective knew he couldn't just arrest Artie outright. Not yet. He needed more than just financial trails. He needed a confession, a direct link to Moretti. He needed Artie to talk. On a drizzly Tuesday morning, October 17, 1967, Miller found Artie Finch at a small diner on 125th Street, nursing a cup of coffee and nervously scanning the street. Artie looked older than his years, the weight of his secrets etching lines around his eyes. Miller slid into the booth opposite him. No badge flashed, no handcuffs clinked. Just a quiet, almost sympathetic gaze. "Mr. Finch," Miller began, his voice low, "we've been looking at your books. Not Bumpy's books, your books." Artie's face went ashen. He tried to stammer a denial, but the words caught in his throat. Miller didn't press. He simply laid out a series of documents on the table, not all of them, just enough to show Artie the depth of their knowledge, bank statements, shell company registrations, even a detailed ledger of Artie's gambling losses and the corresponding payments funneled through Moretti's fronts. "We know about the money, Artie," Miller said, his voice hardening slightly. 7 years of it. We know about the millions, and we know who you've been paying off." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with Artie's. "But what we really want to know is what else you've been giving them. The information, the vulnerabilities, Bumpy Johnson's financial blueprint." Artie Finch, trapped and exposed, finally broke. The dam burst. He confessed to the embezzlement, the years of siphoning off funds, driven by the insatiable maw of his gambling addiction. He confessed to the fear, the constant looking over his shoulder, the desperate hope that Bumpy would never find out. But the true bombshell, the detail that sent a chill down Miller's spine, was the name Artie whispered, his voice barely audible above the diner's clatter. Moretti. Vito Moretti. He knew everything. He told me what to look for, what to take. He said if I didn't, he'd tell Bumpy himself. And then he'd tell my wife. The game had just changed. This wasn't simple theft. This was a calculated, strategic assault on Bumpy Johnson's empire. Artie Finch wasn't a rogue accountant. He was a Trojan horse, systematically feeding Bumpy's financial details and vulnerabilities directly to the Genovese family. It was an invasion from within, orchestrated by Vito the Viper Moretti, designed to weaken Bumpy, to expose him, to force him to cede territory without a single shot fired in public. When Bumpy Johnson received the news, relayed through a trusted intermediary, his reaction was not the explosive fury many expected. There was no immediate rampage, no public declaration of war. Instead, a profound stillness settled over him, a quiet intensity that was far more terrifying than any outburst. He sat in his study, a single lamp casting long shadows, the city humming outside his window. He listened to the details, absorbing every word, every nuance of Artie's confession, every piece of evidence pointing to Moretti. Bumpy understood. He understood the elegance of the ploy, the audacious disrespect, the sheer audacity of trying to dismantle his kingdom from the inside out, using one of his own men. Moretti wasn't just stealing money, he was stealing loyalty, trust, and the very foundation of Bumpy's authority. This wasn't a crime of greed. It was a declaration of war, a silent one, but war nonetheless. And the stakes were no longer just Artie Finch's personal fate. They were the future of Harlem, the balance of power in New York's underworld, and Bumpy Johnson's legendary reputation. To simply eliminate Artie would be to play into Moretti's hands, confirming Bumpy's weakness. To engage in open warfare would be bloody, costly, and exactly what Moretti wanted, a chaotic power vacuum he could exploit. Bumpy Johnson was not a man who fought on his enemy's terms. He was a strategist, a chess master who saw 20 moves ahead. He would respond, yes, but his counter-move would be unexpected, precise, and designed to deliver a lesson that would echo through the streets of New York for decades. A lesson not in violence, but in the true nature of power. The looming question was, how do you publicly humiliate a viper without igniting a blaze that consumes everything? Bumpy spent the next 72 hours in near solitude, the only sounds the rustle of papers and the soft clink of ice in a glass. His lieutenants paced, anxious, awaiting orders. The city held its breath, sensing the shift in the air, the silent tension building like a storm. Bumpy wasn't planning a hit, he was planning a spectacle. He was preparing to turn Moretti's insidious plot into his own stage, to expose the Viper not with a bullet, but with a truth so undeniable, so humiliating, that it would shatter Moretti's ambition without Bumpy lifting a finger. The morning of October 24, 1967, dawned crisp and clear. The air carried the scent of autumn, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of July when this all began. Bumpy Johnson's presence was requested at a summit called by the heads of the 5 families, ostensibly to discuss territorial disputes in the wake of recent unrest. It was a thinly veiled trap, a chance for Moretti to publicly press his advantage, to suggest Bumpy was losing control, to cement the narrative that Harlem was ripe for the taking. The meeting was held in a lavish private dining room at the Hotel Astor, a neutral ground chosen for its perceived impartiality. Around a long polished mahogany table sat the city's most powerful men, their faces etched with suspicion and calculation. Vito Moretti was there, a smug glint in his eyes, believing his plan was reaching its crescendo. Artie Finch, pale and trembling, was seated at a smaller table in a corner, ostensibly to clarify financial discrepancies. But everyone knew he was there as Moretti's pawn, ready to testify to Bumpy's alleged mismanagement. Bumpy Johnson entered the room with his usual unhurried grace, a quiet calm that belied the storm brewing beneath the surface. He nodded to each man, his gaze lingering for a moment on Moretti, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries, quickly devolving into veiled accusations and thinly disguised threats directed at Bumpy. Moretti, playing the part of the concerned associate, began to lay out his case, presenting Artie Finch as the definitive proof of Bumpy's financial vulnerabilities. "Gentlemen," Moretti purred, gesturing to Artie, "Mr. Finch here has some illuminating details regarding certain assets in Harlem, assets that, shall we say, seem to have been less than robustly managed." Artie, prompted by a subtle nod from Moretti, began to speak, his voice a reedy tremor. He started to recount the figures, the siphoned millions, painting a picture of a crumbling financial empire. The room grew quiet, a collective sense of anticipation hanging heavy. This was it, the public humiliation, the dismantling. But then Bumpy Johnson raised a hand, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. The room fell silent. "Artie." Bumpy's voice was soft, conversational, yet it cut through the air like a razor. "Tell them about the laundromats." Artie froze, his eyes darting to Moretti, then back to Bumpy, a look of pure terror dawning on his face. The laundromats, Moretti's fronts, the places where Artie had funneled the stolen money as gambling debts. Moretti shifted, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "What are you talking about, Bumpy? We're discussing your financial irregularities." Bumpy ignored him. His eyes remained fixed on Artie. "Tell them, Artie. Tell them how Vito Moretti used your weakness, your addiction, to funnel my money through his businesses. Tell them how he promised you protection, promised to keep you safe, while he systematically tried to bankrupt me and take my territory from within." Artie Finch, caught between two monsters, finally cracked completely. The pressure of months, years of living a double life, collapsed. He began to confess, not just to the embezzlement, but to Moretti's orchestration, the meetings, the instructions, the sheer scale of the betrayal. He detailed how Moretti had exploited his gambling debts, turning him into an unwilling informant, a financial spy. He spoke of the threats against his family, the constant fear. The words tumbled out, raw and desperate, painting a vivid picture of Moretti's calculated treachery. The room erupted, not with anger at Bumpy, but with cold fury at Moretti. To steal was one thing, to use one's own accountant as a Trojan horse, to undermine a respected boss through such a deceitful, cowardly ploy, violated every unwritten code of the underworld. It wasn't about the money. It was about the method. It was about respect or the utter lack thereof. Moretti tried to interject, to deny, to threaten, but his words were drowned out by the angry murmurs. The icon of the moment wasn't a gunshot or a broken bone. It was the simple, undeniable truth, spoken by a broken man, laid bare for all to see. It was the moment Bumpy Johnson produced a small, leather-bound ledger, not Artie's, but one he had compiled. It contained dates, amounts, and the names of Moretti's shell corporations, cross-referenced with Artie's gambling payouts. Evidence Miller had quietly passed to Bumpy, knowing Bumpy would use it in a way the law never could. The ledger, silent and damning, was the final irrefutable witness. In that moment, Vito Moretti wasn't just exposed. He was utterly disgraced. He had tried to play a chess game, only to find Bumpy Johnson was playing three-dimensional chess. The respect he craved, the power he sought evaporated in a cloud of humiliation. His own ambition had become his undoing. The aftermath was swift and brutal, though not a drop of blood was shed by Bumpy's hand. Within minutes, the summit dissolved. Moretti was ostracized, his influence among the families shattered. His own capo, disgusted by his tactics, began to distance themselves. Within 72 hours, Moretti was effectively exiled, stripped of his power, his name a byword for treachery and incompetence. He retreated to a small forgotten corner of Brooklyn, his grand ambitions reduced to dust. Artie Finch, his confession recorded by Miller and now a matter of public record, was quietly taken into protective custody, his life ruined, but spared by the very man he betrayed.